really thrilled to be here talking about this because this is a scandal which remains unresolved, and a scandal that we should still be thinking about. It's probably the most disturbing issue that I've worked on as a journalist, and also I think the most shocking example that I've ever encountered of a government willfully pursuing a harsh policy whilst ignoring the really catastrophic impact that that policy was having on people's lives. It's been 3 years now since the government first apologised for the debacle. And since then, we've had profuse apologies from 3 consecutive Home Secretaries and commitments to reform from 2 Prime Ministers, promises that they want to do right by the Windrush generation. But many of the people affected are still waiting for justice. They're still in debt, they're still facing eviction letters as a direct consequence of Home Office mistakes. The government displayed a really unforgivable slowness to act once the scandal was exposed in 2018, and is showing still an ongoing and quite incomprehensible slowness to put things right. So just to remind you, the Windrush scandal was a Home Office orchestrated disaster whereby thousands of people who've been living in the UK for decades entirely legally were mistakenly designated as illegal immigrants with really catastrophic consequences. Some people were sacked from their jobs. Others were denied NHS healthcare. Some people were made homeless. Other people were arrested and held in immigration detention centres. Other people were removed to countries that they hadn't lived in since they were children, up to half a century earlier. This was something that kind of fell on my radar in about at the beginning, end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And one of the first people who I interviewed then was a man called Renford McIntyre, who is here. Renford was about 64 when I met him in early 2018. I find this slide really upsetting, but I show it because it illustrates really clearly how badly people were affected by the Home Office mistake. So Renford was somebody who'd arrived in Britain as a child in the 1960s. He'd gone to school here, had worked here for decades, paid taxes for decades, and was working for the NHS as a driver when in 2014, the government increased the immigration checks that employers were required to do. He was unable to show decisively that he had the right to live in the UK. And as a result of this, he was sacked by the hospital that he was working for, and he was consequently unable to pay rent. He became homeless. He had to live in a abandoned industrial unit in a place with no heating or running water. When I interviewed him, he was puzzled by what had happened to him, but also absolutely furious. Around the same time, I met Paulette Wilson, who'd also come to Britain in the 1960s as a child. She'd been born in Jamaica, but came here entirely legally, went to primary school here, secondary school, had a daughter, had a granddaughter, worked in the House of Commons for a while. And in 2017, she received a letter from the Home Office telling her that she was here illegally and needed to leave the country. She was arrested twice. She was taken to immigration detention, and she was booked on a flight back to Jamaica. At the time when I was reporting on those stories, it wasn't at all clear what had gone wrong. But it was really puzzling that the Home Office was sending out letters telling people that they had no legal right to live in the UK, even though the individuals who were receiving those letters knew that they were here legally and knew that a mistake had been made. But somehow there was no persuading Home Office officials that that there was a kind of bureaucratic disaster. and individual after individual was taken into immigration detention, and people were being threatened with removal, and some people were in fact removed. This is the document that Anthony Bryan had to carry around with him. Anthony was somebody, again, who arrived in Britain in the 1960s as a young child, worked here all his life, brought his family up, and was told again in 2016 that he was an illegal immigrant. And he was held in immigration detention for 5 weeks without really anyone being able to explain to him why it was that he was being treated so harshly, even though he'd kind of committed no offence. Once we began to publish these stories in The Guardian, I began to get a kind of a series of phone calls and emails from other people who were similarly affected. Some of them had been arrested, others had been sacked from their jobs. And it's kind of hard to, it's hard to stress how badly people were affected. These are just some of the many, many people whose really difficult situations we featured in The Guardian, but there are amongst them, there's ambulance drivers who were sacked from their jobs, special needs teaching assistants who were sacked from their jobs, people who were forced to go back to countries that they'd left as 4-year-olds around 60 years later, because they were so terrified by the government's, by the Home Office's kind of persecution of them. I think what's quite interesting for me talking with the other journalists here is how old-fashioned, in a way, this exercise was as a journalistic exercise. It involved me taking trains to, to different parts of the country, sitting down with people, going through their immigration paperwork. I felt for a long time like I'd almost become an immigration caseworker, but there was nothing kind of particularly, clever that I found out about this disaster from the internet. There was no kind of special tricks about it. It was very much old-fashioned shoe leather journalism of pacing around and spending a long time talking to people. It was quite a frustrating thing to report on because it took a really, really long time to get any political response from the government. For the first months of reporting it, the Home Office tried to pretend that this wasn't an issue that was particularly important. It wasn't an issue that was affecting very many people, but it was really only through the kind of consistent, repeated reporting on disastrous situation after disastrous situation that we finally managed to force the government to apologise. And you can see from these front pages that we put the story on the front page in April of 2018, every day for a fortnight. And at the beginning of the fortnight, the government kind of apologised and said that the policy would be changed and that they were very sorry that a mistake had been made, but the apologies were fairly muted. By the end of the fortnight, the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd had been forced to resign, and there was beginning to be a real understanding that something really had to change. This, as I say, was 3 years ago. I want to be very upbeat about the kind of the power of journalism to force change, because I think that this was a really, really kind of optimistic example of getting, of holding the government to account and showing how badly things were going wrong. And The Guardian was kind of the perfect medium for doing it, because we were able to grab lots of people's attention, and there was a kind of a snowballing effect of more and more people coming forward as they saw our coverage online particularly, but also in print. So I do feel really kind of positive about what's been achieved as a result of this. 13,000 people have been given paperwork proving that they are in fact not illegal immigrants. A lot of people have got their jobs back. Many people were flown at the government's expense back from exile in the countries to which they've been deported. However, it is an ongoing issue. I spoke to Renford McIntyre this week, and his situation remains really, really dire. He hasn't had compensation yet, although it's been promised. And the whole slow movement towards compensation is almost a second scandal. This is a picture of Paulette Wilson on the right-hand side, who I last saw in June when she and other victims went to Downing Street to call on the government to kind of pay the compensation that they promised and to implement all of the reforms to the Home Office that they promised. Unfortunately, Paulette died in the autumn before receiving the full amount of compensation, and the reforms, the kind of promise of a compassionate immigration system and a reformed Home Office that we've had promised on multiple occasions still hasn't happened. So I suppose my kind of optimism is muted, but it does make me think that this is an ongoing issue and an issue that we have to continue to highlight in journalism, with journalism.